I agreed with a lie today, just to stop a room full of strangers from looking at me. I felt the pressure of their eyes, and I voluntarily severed my own connection to reality, smiling as I repeated words I knew were false. My integrity dissolved in seconds under the silent weight of a minor social disagreement. We all desperately cling to the belief that our convictions are carved in stone, that our perception of the truth is an impenetrable fortress. But I found a terrifying document that proves this independence is nothing but a fragile, pathetic illusion. It details a psychological ambush, where over 100 perfectly sane young men walked voluntarily into a drab college classroom, only to have their physical reality systematically dismantled. We are starting at the surface of this seemingly harmless laboratory experiment, but we are going down into the absolute darkest depths of human compliance, the unseen architecture of peer pressure, and the chilling realization that your own vision is overwhelmingly dictated by the people sitting next to you. Welcome to the investigation. Let us examine the machinery of conformity. To truly understand the gravity of what happened in that room, we must first immerse ourselves in the psychological landscape of the era. The year was 1951. The ashes of the Second World War were still smoldering in the collective memory of the world. The Nuremberg trials had exposed a horrifying truth about human nature, revealing that atrocities were not solely committed by cartoonish monsters or deranged psychopaths. They were committed by ordinary people. Accountants, bakers, teachers, and farmers who had simply followed orders and conformed to the madness of their society. The global intellectual community was paralyzed by a singular, haunting question. How does a seemingly rational society descend into unanimous, murderous compliance? Was it something unique to the cultural water of authoritarian regimes, or was there a fatal flaw hidden within the basic programming of the human brain? In America, this fear of mass compliance was ironically paired with a domestic culture of intense conformity. The post-war economic boom had created the suburbs, a landscape of identical houses, identical lawns, and identical nuclear families. To stand out in the 1950s was to invite suspicion. The Red Scare was at its peak. Senator Joseph McCarthy was actively hunting communists, and the mere accusation of being different could destroy a career, a reputation, and a life. In this atmosphere of hyper-vigilance and enforced normalcy, questioning the consensus was not just impolite, it was dangerous. Conformity was the absolute currency of survival. Enter Solomon Asch. Born in Warsaw, Poland, Asch had immigrated to the United States as a young boy. He had grown up straddling two worlds, acutely aware of how culture and social expectations shape human behavior. He was a pioneer in Gestalt psychology, a school of thought which argues that the human mind perceives whole patterns rather than isolated components. The whole is entirely different from the sum of its parts. Asch applied this philosophy not just to visual shapes, but to human societies. He watched the rise of totalitarianism in Europe with profound dread. He refused to accept the prevailing theory of the time, which suggested that humans were nothing more than mindless sheep easily hypnotized by propaganda. Asch wanted to believe in the rational independence of the individual. He wanted to prove that if you put a normal, sane person in a room and asked them a question with an obvious, undeniable objective answer, they would trust their own eyes over the lies of the crowd. He designed an experiment intended to prove human resilience. Instead, he accidentally documented our most pathetic vulnerability. The stage for this psychological ambush was set at Swarthmore College, a prestigious liberal arts institution in Pennsylvania. The environment was vital to the deception. Swarthmore was a place of high intellect, rational discourse, and academic rigor. It was the last place one would expect reality to be systematically dismantled. The experimental setup was aggressively mundane. A drab classroom. A long wooden table. 8 chairs arranged in a gentle semicircle facing a blackboard. When the true participant, the naive subject, walked into the room, he would find 7 other young men already seated. These 7 men looked exactly like him. They wore similar clothes, carried similar notebooks, and engaged in similar idle chatter. They were perfectly ordinary college students. But they were not participants. They were Confederates. Actors hired and meticulously trained by Solomon Asch to execute a precise, synchronized psychological assault. The naive subject, taking the last available seat near the end of the semicircle, was entirely unaware that he was the only real target in the room. He was a mouse who had just walked voluntarily into a perfectly engineered trap. The experimenter, a stern man in a white coat projecting absolute academic authority, stood at the front of the room. He explained that this was a test of visual judgment. He produced 2 large, white cardboard posters. On the first poster, there was a single, bold black vertical line. This was the target line. On the second poster, there were 3 vertical lines of varying lengths, labeled A, B, and C. The task was insultingly simple. The men in the room simply had to look at the 3 lines and state out loud which one was exactly the same length as the target line. The differences were not subtle. This was not a trick of the light or an optical illusion. The correct answer was glaringly obvious. To fail this test, you would have to be legally blind or completely untethered from reality. The experimenter announced that they would go around the room, starting from the left, and each person would state their answer aloud. Because the naive subject had taken the second to last seat, he would always be one of the last to speak. He would have to sit and listen to the judgments of the group before rendering his own. Trial 1 began. The experimenter revealed the cards. The correct answer was clearly line B. The first Confederate, speaking in a calm, bored tone, said line B. The second Confederate agreed. Line B. The third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, all perfectly uniform in their boredom and their accuracy. When it was the naive subject's turn, he confidently stated line B. It was a perfectly ordinary moment. The tension in the room was non-existent. The subject likely felt a wave of relief mixed with profound boredom. This was going to be an easy, albeit tedious, way to earn a few dollars. Trial 2 proceeded in exactly the same manner. The correct answer was A. Every single Confederate chose A. The subject chose A. The atmosphere in the room was entirely relaxed. The baseline of trust had been successfully established. The naive subject now fully believed that the men around him were just as rational, perceptive, and bored as he was. The trap had been baited. The illusion of a shared reality was completely solid. And then came trial 3. The experimenter placed a new set of cards on the easel. The target line was unmistakably identical to line C. It was not even a close comparison. Line A was much shorter, and line B was drastically longer. The naive subject looked at the cards, identified the correct answer in a fraction of a second, and waited for the boring procession of agreement to pass. The first Confederate cleared his throat and looked directly at the cards. He did not hesitate. In the exact same calm, bored voice he had used before, he said, line A. The naive subject's brain experienced a microscopic stutter. A tiny spike of cognitive dissonance. He probably blinked, assuming the first man simply misspoke. But then the second Confederate looked at the cards and calmly stated, "Line A." The subject shifted in his chair. He squinted at the posters. Was he missing something? Was it a trick angle? The third Confederate spoke. "Line A." The fourth. "Line A." The fifth. "Line A." The sixth. "Line A." The unanimous wall of completely incorrect consensus was closing in on him. And now, it was his turn. To understand the sheer agony of this moment, we have to look past the superficial simplicity of the task and examine the profound biological machinery at work. When the naive subject is suddenly confronted with a unanimous group that contradicts his immediate physical reality, he is not just experiencing mild confusion. His brain is registering a massive threat to his survival. For hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, belonging to the tribe was the sole prerequisite for continued existence. If you disagreed with the tribe in the Paleolithic era, you were not just ostracized. You were exiled. And exile meant death by starvation or predation. The human brain evolved to interpret social rejection as an immediate, life-threatening emergency. Modern neuroimaging studies have shown that the pain of social exclusion activates the exact same neural pathways in the brain as physical injury. When the 6 men before him unanimously declare that a short line is long, the subject is not engaged in a philosophical debate about geometry. His nervous system is screaming at him that to break the harmony of the group is to step out into the freezing wilderness alone. As the experimenter looks expectantly at the naive subject, the physical symptoms of extreme stress begin to manifest. His heart rate spikes. His palms begin to sweat. His breathing becomes shallow and irregular. He is trapped in a violently shrinking space between his own functioning eyes and the crushing weight of the social environment. He looks at the lines again. He leans forward. He desperately tries to find the logic in their error. He looks at the faces of the Confederates. He is searching for a smirk, a wink, any sign that this is a practical joke. But the actors are flawless. They are staring back at him with blank, polite, expectant expressions. They are totally unified in their alternate reality. The silence in the room stretches out, thick and suffocating. The entire social order of this tiny universe depends on him falling in line. The pressure is a physical weight pressing down on his chest. And then, he speaks. He swallows his pride, he buries his conviction, and he whispers, "Line A." This was not a rare occurrence. This was not a statistical anomaly. Over the course of the experiment, Asch subjected his participants to 18 separate trials. In 12 of those trials, the Confederates were instructed to give unanimously incorrect answers. The results shattered Asch's idealistic view of human independence. A staggering 75% of the participants conformed to the incorrect group at least once. Across all the critical trials, the subjects surrendered to the false consensus roughly 1/3 of the time. Let that sink in. 1 out of every 3 times a person was asked to identify an obvious physical fact, they chose to lie because the people around them were lying. These were not uneducated people. These were bright, critical thinking university students at a prestigious academic institution. They were in a completely safe environment. There was no gun to their head. There was no threat of violence, no loss of income, no permanent social ruin. The only weapon the group wielded was polite, unanimous disagreement. And it was enough to make perfectly sane men publicly deny the evidence of their own eyes. But the raw numbers, horrifying as they are, do not tell the whole story. The true darkness of the Asch Conformity experiments lies in what happened after the trials were over. When the experiment concluded, the experimenter revealed the deception to the naive subject. The relief in the room was palpable. The subjects laughed nervously, wiped sweat from their foreheads, and admitted to the intense agony they had just endured. Asch conducted deep, methodical interviews with every single participant to understand precisely why they had yielded to the group. He discovered that conformity was not a monolith. It was a complex, multi-layered phenomenon that eroded the individual in three distinct, terrifying ways. He categorized these failures of independence into three distinct distortions. The first, and most common, was the distortion of action. These participants knew exactly what the correct answer was. They never doubted their own vision. They knew the group was entirely wrong. But they conformed anyway because they could not bear the social friction of being the odd man out. They consciously chose to suppress the truth to avoid standing out. They decided that blending in was more important than being correct. This is the conformity of the coward, the conscious surrender of integrity for the sake of social comfort. The second category of yielding was far more insidious. Asch called this the distortion of judgment. These participants experienced a deep cognitive failure. When confronted with the unanimous group, they did not just decide to lie. They actively began to doubt their own competence. They convinced themselves that they must be wrong. They reasoned that 7 other intelligent men could not possibly all make the same mistake, so the error must lie within themselves. Perhaps they had misunderstood the instructions. Perhaps they were sitting at a bad angle. Perhaps their eyesight was failing. They engaged in rapid, desperate mental gymnastics to justify the group's reality. They outsourced their logic, their critical thinking, and their self-trust to the herd. This is the conformity of the insecure mind. It is the terrified assumption that the crowd is always wiser than the individual. These people did not just lie to the experimenter. They lied to themselves. They built a bridge of rationalization to cross over from the truth into the comfortable warmth of the majority. But it was the third category that truly disturbed Solomon Asch. It was a small minority of participants, but their existence was a terrifying revelation about the plasticity of human consciousness. Asch called this the distortion of perception. During the interviews, these subjects did not admit to feeling social pressure. They did not admit to doubting their judgment. They sat there, looking perfectly calm, and stated that they genuinely saw the lines as equal. They were not lying to fit in. They were not second-guessing themselves. The sheer psychological weight of the unanimous group had literally reached back into their visual cortex and altered their perception of physical reality. The social consensus had overwritten their sensory input. Their brains had completely warped the physical dimensions of the lines to match the words spoken by the Confederates. This is the absolute darkest depth of the iceberg. This implies that reality is not a fixed construct. It implies that if enough people around you insist that the sky is red, your brain will eventually adjust its processing, modify the colors hitting your retina, and present you with a red sky. It is the ultimate terrifying proof that human reality is profoundly, perhaps fundamentally, socially constructed. Decades after Solomon Asch conducted his initial trials at Swarthmore, modern neuroscience provided the terrifying physical proof of his theories. In the early 2000s, a team of researchers at Emory University replicated the Asch Conformity experiment while placing the participants inside a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner. They wanted to see what was physically happening inside the brain when a person was subjected to the unanimous lies of the group. The researchers expected to see heavy activity in the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for conscious decision-making, conflict resolution, and planning. They assumed that the participants were actively, consciously calculating the social cost of rebellion and deciding to lie. But the brain scans revealed a truth that was infinitely more disturbing. When the participants conformed to the incorrect group, there was almost no activity in the prefrontal cortex. Instead, the scans showed a massive spike of activity in the occipital lobe and the parietal lobe. These are the regions of the brain strictly dedicated to visual perception and spatial awareness. The brain was not consciously deciding to lie. The social pressure was actually altering the brain's physical perception of the image. The consensus of the crowd was reaching deep into the neurochemistry of the individual and rewriting the visual data before it even reached the conscious mind. The participants who yielded were not choosing to deceive the experimenter. They were literally seeing a different reality. The implications of this neurological discovery are apocalyptic for the concept of objective truth. It proves that human vision is not a camera objectively recording the world. It is a highly subjective rendering engine, deeply sensitive to social data, constantly updating and editing the physical world to ensure that the individual remains aligned with the tribe. We are biologically programmed to hallucinate a false reality if it prevents us from being socially ostracized. Asch was horrified by his own findings. He had set out to prove human independence, but he had accidentally mapped the precise blueprints of mass delusion. He immediately began to manipulate the variables of the experiment to find the breaking point of this phenomenon. He wanted to know how to shatter the illusion of the group. And he found a magic bullet. He ran the experiment again, but this time, he instructed just one of the 7 confederates to give the correct answer. Just one dissenting voice in a sea of lies. The effect was immediate and spectacular. When the naive subject had just one single ally in the room, conformity plummeted from 37% to a mere 5%. The spell was broken. The presence of a single person speaking the truth destroyed the absolute authority of the majority. The naive subject suddenly found his courage. He no longer felt the crushing weight of total isolation. He answered correctly, confidently, and consistently. This revealed a profound truth about totalitarianism and social control. To maintain absolute power, a system does not need to convince everyone. It only needs to project the illusion of absolute unanimity. The moment a single crack of dissent appears, the entire facade of consensus begins to crumble. This is why authoritarian regimes respond to even the mildest criticism with overwhelming, disproportionate force. They are terrified of the single dissenting voice, because they know it is the only thing that breaks the hypnotic trance of the crowd. But Asch pushed the boundaries further. What would happen if that lone dissenting voice was suddenly removed? In another variation, Asch had the dissenting Confederates suddenly switch sides halfway through the experiment and join the incorrect majority. The results were devastating. The naive subject, who had been confidently giving the correct answers while he had an ally, immediately collapsed. As soon as the true partner abandoned him, conformity spiked right back up to its original, massive levels. The subject's independence was not a permanent state of mind. It was entirely conditional, completely dependent on external validation. Asch then tried another variation. The latecomer. In this setup, the naive subject arrived late to the experiment. The experimenter told him that since he missed the instructions, he should just write his answers down privately on a piece of paper while the rest of the group stated theirs aloud. The Confederates proceeded to give their unanimously wrong answers. The subject sat there, surrounded by the incorrect majority, but entirely insulated from their gaze. Under these conditions, conformity vanished almost entirely. The subject consistently wrote down the correct answers. This proved that the core driver of the Asch effect is not a genuine change in belief for most people, but the sheer, intolerable terror of public exposure. It is the gaze of the crowd, the threat of being witnessed as a deviant, that forces the surrender of the self. Imagine the psychological aftermath for a naive subject returning to his dormitory after the experiment. He walked into that room believing he was an independent, rational adult. He walked out carrying the quiet, corrosive knowledge that his integrity could be dismantled in minutes by nothing more than the polite disagreement of strangers. He sits on his bed, looking at the familiar objects in his room, and a creeping paranoia begins to set in. How many of his core beliefs are actually his own? How much of his political ideology, his religious faith, his fashion sense, and his moral compass are genuine reflections of his inner self, and how much is simply the accumulated residue of the Asch effect? He begins to reevaluate every conversation he has ever had. He remembers the times he laughed at a joke he did not find funny just because the rest of the table was laughing. He remembers the times he nodded along with a professor's opinion he secretly despised just to avoid the friction of a debate. The lines on the cardboard poster were just a sterile laboratory abstraction, but the mechanism they exposed is operating constantly in every human interaction. The subject realizes that he is living in a permanent state of subtle, continuous negotiation with the crowd. The terrifying truth is that there is no solid, impenetrable core of identity. There is only a fragile, shifting surface of perception, constantly buffeted by the gravitational pull of the people around us. When we pull back from the laboratory and look at the broader canvas of human history, the Asch Conformity experiments cease to be an academic curiosity. They become a terrifying decoder ring for our darkest atrocities. Think of the insidious nature of cults. Jim Jones did not convince 900 people to drink poison in the jungles of Guyana through rational argument. He built a closed environment, a physical and psychological compound, where dissenting voices were systematically silenced. He created a completely artificial unanimous consensus. When every single person around you is nodding in agreement, praising the leader, and validating the delusions, your brain eventually gives up the fight. The distortion of judgment takes over. You convince yourself that the group must be right. You drink the poison because the social friction of refusing it is perceived by your primitive brain as a fate worse than death. Cults utilize the precise architecture of the Swarthmore classroom. They isolate the subject, enforce a unanimous false reality, and wait for the psychological immune system to collapse. But we do not need to look at extreme cults to see the Asch effect in action. It is woven into the fabric of our boardrooms, our military command centers, and our political institutions. It is the fatal engine of groupthink. Consider the architecture of a modern corporate hierarchy, which functions as an industrialized version of the Asch experiment. When a board of directors gathers to make a critical decision, the environment is fundamentally designed to suppress dissent. The chief executive officer, functioning as the ultimate experimenter in the white coat, often sets the implicit agenda. The senior vice presidents, eager to signal their loyalty and secure their positions, rapidly align with the perceived consensus, effectively becoming the unanimous Confederates. By the time the question reaches the junior executives or the external advisors, the gravitational pull of the room is immense. A young analyst might possess the exact financial data proving that a proposed merger is a catastrophic mistake. He might see the disparity between the lines with absolute clarity. But when he looks around the mahogany table and sees 7 highly paid, deeply confident executives nodding in unison, the distortion of judgment activates. He assumes they must possess some proprietary knowledge, some superior strategic vision that he lacks. He silences his alarms. He conforms to the room. This phenomenon is responsible for some of the most devastating corporate collapses in history. Massive disasters were not solely the result of calculated malice by a few bad actors. They were enabled by thousands of intelligent, capable individuals who walked into a room, saw the glaring anomalies, and chose to agree with the prevailing delusion because the social and financial cost of rebellion was simply too high. The modern economy is largely driven by a massive, interconnected network of Asch Conformity trials, where the fear of breaking the harmony consistently overrides the imperative of rational analysis. In the realm of politics, the Asch experiment perfectly explains the phenomenon known as the spiral of silence. When a political faction gains a loud, aggressive majority, people who hold opposing views naturally begin to self-censor. They observe the hostility directed at dissenters. They feel the temperature of the room. And they decide that the social cost of speaking their truth is simply too high. They nod along, they stay silent, or they actively pretend to support the dominant narrative. This silence creates a false illusion of total consensus, which in turn causes even more people to self-censor. The spiral accelerates until the entire society is locked in a massive, unspoken lie. Totalitarian regimes do not rise entirely through the threat of violence or the secret police. They rise by weaponizing the Asch effect. They make sure the propaganda is ubiquitous, that the neighbors are watching, and that the illusion of unanimous agreement is completely impenetrable. They force the citizen into the ultimate distortion of action, a daily, exhausting performance of compliance. If we trace the roots of this vulnerability, we must look at the environments that shape our earliest cognitive development. Our vulnerability to the Asch effect is not entirely biological, it is meticulously cultivated by the structures of our society, beginning with the modern education system. From the moment a child enters a classroom at the age of 5, they are immersed in a highly structured environment designed to prioritize obedience and consensus over independent critical thought. The architecture of a traditional classroom, with its neat rows of forward-facing desks, the absolute authority of the teacher standing at the front, and the strict adherence to the sounding of the bell, is practically a dress rehearsal for the Swarthmore Laboratory. Children are implicitly taught that there is only one correct answer to any given problem, and that this answer is possessed by the authority figure and validated by the group. They are conditioned to seek permission to speak, to raise their hands, and to carefully monitor the reactions of their peers before expressing a dissenting opinion. By the time a student graduates, they have spent over a decade participating in a continuous, low-level conformity exercise. The neural pathways that reward group alignment are deeply reinforced, while the pathways required for independent, rebellious thought are allowed to atrophy. We should not be surprised that adults easily surrender their perception to the crowd when they have been trained to do exactly that since childhood. The Asch experiment simply exploits a cognitive reflex that society has spent years installing and refining. But perhaps the most chilling application of Solomon Asch's work is not found in the history books of the 20th century. It is found right now, glowing brightly in the palm of your hand. The digital age has constructed the ultimate, inescapable Asch room. Social media platforms are not just communication tools. They are the most efficient conformity engines ever devised by human engineering. Every time you open a feed, you are walking into that classroom at Swarthmore. But instead of 7 Confederates, you are facing 7 million. The algorithm is the experimenter in the white coat, meticulously curating the voices you hear to create an absolute illusion of consensus. When you see a post with 100,000 likes, thousands of shares, and hundreds of aggressive comments validating a specific viewpoint, you are looking at the lines on the poster. Your brain processes that massive numerical engagement as the unanimous opinion of the tribe. If you disagree, you are not just disagreeing with a room full of college students. You are disagreeing with the entire world. The weaponization of this digital consensus is happening every second of every day. Coordinated campaigns use massive networks of automated accounts to artificially inflate the popularity of a political candidate, a corporate product, or a cultural narrative. They create a fake majority out of thin air. They manufacture the millions of Confederates and program them to shout in unison. And when a real, naive human being logs on and sees this wall of artificial agreement, their ancient, primitive brain reacts exactly the same way the students did in 1951. They doubt their own judgment. They self-censor. They modify their opinions to align with a synthetic mob. The mob doesn't even have to be real. It only has to appear real to trigger the evolutionary fear of ostracization. The internet has automated the destruction of independent thought. We are voluntarily subjecting ourselves to millions of critical trials every single day, and we are failing them at a staggering rate. Breaking this conditioning requires more than just intellectual awareness. It requires a conscious, repeated willingness to endure psychological discomfort. It requires practicing what we might call micro-rebellions of truth. The physical sensation of breaking conformity is initially terrifying. When you stand in a room and speak a truth that contradicts the unanimous lies of the group, your body will react as if it is under physical attack. Your sympathetic nervous system will trigger the fight or flight response. You will feel the adrenaline surge, the sudden flush of heat in your face, and the desperate, instinctive urge to retract your statement and apologize. But if you can endure that initial spike of terror, if you can hold your ground and refuse to let the distortion of judgment take root, something profound happens. The terror eventually recedes, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. You realize that the crowd has no actual power over your mind unless you voluntarily surrender it. The illusion of the unanimous majority shatters. You become the true partner, the lone dissenting voice that Solomon Asch discovered could completely destroy the conformity effect. By simply stating the obvious, undeniable truth, you not only reclaim your own cognitive sovereignty, but you grant unconscious permission to others in the room to do the same. You become the crack in the facade. The power of peer pressure is absolute, but it is also incredibly fragile. It relies entirely on your silence. And the moment you choose to speak, the entire dark machinery of the experiment grinds to a halt. What Solomon Asch revealed was a terrifying glitch in the human operating system. We are deeply, biologically wired to trust the pack over our own perception. We want to believe that we are the heroes of our own stories. We want to believe that if we were placed in that room, we would stand up, point at the poster, and confidently declare that line C is the correct answer. We tell ourselves that we would never succumb to the pressure. We tell ourselves that our vision is clear and our convictions are unshakable. But the cold, hard statistics of the Asch experiments do not care about your ego. The data suggests that you are far more likely to be the one who caves. You are the one who smiles nervously, doubts your own eyes, and slowly, quietly, aligns your reality with the lies of the crowd. The true horror of the Asch Conformity experiments is not that the subjects were weak, or stupid, or malicious. The horror is that they were completely normal. The banality of conformity is the dark matter of human psychology. It is the invisible force that holds society together, but it is also the force that can seamlessly drag us into absolute madness. The next time you find yourself in a room where everyone is nodding in agreement, the next time you feel that subtle, sinking pressure to suppress your dissenting voice, remember the classroom at Swarthmore. Remember the lines on the cardboard poster. Remember that reality is often the first casualty of consensus. You might think you are simply being polite. You might think you are just avoiding unnecessary conflict. But in that moment of silent surrender, you are fundamentally losing a piece of yourself. You are giving away the only thing that truly belongs to you. Your mind. Consider this an inoculation. The illusion has been shattered. The machinery has been exposed. The investigation into the darkness of conformity is complete. The only question left is what you will do the next time you are asked to measure the line.